Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Mike, for the introduction. We're really happy that you're all here to learn about the project that we have embarked on. Actually, 3 years ago, we embarked on this project, and it is named Unvarnished, Moving History Organizations to Interpret De facto Segregation in the Northern and Western United States. And you might notice that little red correction up there above the title of the grant project, because what we have really found over the time that we've all been working together is that this was more than just customary practices in areas and informal segregation. This really was a practice that was deeply embedded into our legal system, into our laws, into our statutes. So we've since added the de jure. So it's certainly one of the learnings that we've had over the process. So this project is funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. It is a leadership grant that was awarded in September of 2017. And we will complete our work in the fall of 2021. And over the course of this session, we're going to talk a little bit about what that work is. So how did this project come about? It came about because the museum where I work, in Napier Settlement, is in the suburbs of Chicago. And we were founded in 1969. And really, we're telling a story that was very traditional for our type of museum, primarily a very white settlement story that was rooted in the 19th century. And in 2006, organizationally, we made a decision that we would change our mission and we would interpret the history of Naperville through present day. And Naperville of 2006, and even today, was very, very different than the Naperville of 1969. Our community is essentially now a techno-burb. We're, depending on the day, we're the third or fourth largest city in Illinois. And our population is 21% Asian, 5% African American, 5% Latinx. So that was very different than the founding in 1969, when the community was essentially all white. And we wanted to know, how did that happen? How did that happen over a 50-year time span? How did the community change? How did it change population-wise? How did it change? And why was it originally all white? Was that by happen chance? Was it an accident? From 07 to 11, we had a Teaching American History grant, which was a significant Department of Education grant program for history museums to do work with their and universities to do work with their local school districts. And we really looked hard at the 1960s. And what we found was that Naperville was a sundown town. And we're going to go into that a bit more when Nick and Sabrina do their presentation. But what that means is that we were a community that deliberately excluded anyone but whites. And the way that sundown towns occurred had a variety of complexities. But one of the ways that that would happen is that there would be, and you can see some samples on the screen here, there would be systems, real estate systems in place where there would be racially or religiously restrictive covenants that followed a property, which would say essentially that if you weren't white, you could not buy this property. So we wanted to know more about this. And so we wrote the grant. And as I said, it was awarded in 2017. And we brought together a consortium of organizations to work together to really see if their communities had similar practices. And we selected museums that were across the Northern and Western United States. And you're going to ask, why the Northern, why the Western United States? That's because, in an overly simplistic way, we look and we say, well, really it was the American South that was segregated, right? But when you really do a deeper look, the North and the West had many practices of segregation. So the consortium is made up of the Brea Museum and Historical Society from Brea, California, Napier Settlement, the museum that I'm a part of, the Noah Webster House in West Hartford, Connecticut, the Oak Park River Forest Historical Society in Illinois, the Ohio History Connection, which is a state-run, statewide organization, and African Heritage Inc. in Appleton, which is the story that you're really going to hear about today. And we selected these museums for a variety of reasons. We wanted to have small museums, medium, large organizations. We also wanted to have access to different types of exclusionary stories. So the story in West Hartford is different than the story in Brea, California, but it is still a story of exclusion. Having Appleton and African Heritage Inc. on this project came about because in 2015, I was at an American Association for State and Local History Awards banquet. And one of the awardees was the project that included Appleton. And when I was conceiving this project, Appleton really had the more significant story of sharing the practice of sundown culture with their community. They had an exhibit. And I really felt very strongly that we needed this project on this grant because they had begun this practice. And each of these constituents were selected, as I was mentioning, to tell different aspects of the same kind of story, which is segregation. So what are the consortium activities? We have professional development. We are meeting with a wide variety of scholars. We are looking at different kinds of practices. We are learning from experts how to do oral histories, most especially how to do oral histories around stories that have been previously marginalized. Because sometimes it's hard to ferret out who you need to go to talk about these histories. Organizational capacity building. Working together as a national cohort is in and of itself capacity building. You have the opportunity to network, to learn. Community engagement. We are all engaging with our local communities in one way or another. For example, we did a series of focus groups at each location with the International Sites of Conscience to talk about race in each of the participating communities, to talk about how people are looking at inclusive history. We also have been to each other's locations over the last 3 years. The pandemic right now actually made us have a remote visit to our final destination, which was Columbus, Ohio, before we started the nitty-gritty of working on our exhibit. And we've done substantial groundbreaking research around inclusive history and how much and at what point on the trajectory are Americans in wanting to know inclusive history. So what's the purpose of this grant? What's the outcome? Certainly the purpose for each organization is to model telling a holistic story of their community history. Not covering up the parts that they don't want to share, not keeping things hidden, but actually putting it right out there and having exhibits, having conversation, using this as a community-wide learning tool. So the first step, as I mentioned, was the research, and we have a substantial research study that occurred, and it surveyed museum practitioners, museum goers, and the general population. And I can share with you later where you might reference that material, which was actually just rolled out a couple of weeks ago at the American Association for State and Local History Conference. Wilkening consultants. Wilkening Research is the group that is working on that study. We're also doing deep historical research in each of our local communities. And as well, I mentioned the focus groups. So what are we going to do with all of this work that we're doing? We are going to offer the field case studies on how we did our work and best practices on what we learned along the way. So you might see us popping up in technical leaflets or in blogs over the next year. The most substantial outcome of this project is going to be an online exhibit highlighting these 6 communities and their history of segregation through the practice of sundown towns or other racially, religious, and exclusive practices. Primarily, we're doing this primarily through real estate, looking at real estate practices. So that will be an online exhibit. And then we really are hearing from our local communities. We have had superintendents of schools coming to us and saying, please, will you please develop a curriculum for each of your communities so that we can actually use this within our school systems. So when that started occurring, we really knew that we had something that was important. We all know it's been a rough few years as far as the conversations around race in our communities and events that have happened. And every one of our communities in this project are being impacted in one way or another. And we are having community conversations. It's a really, really important aspect of our project that we have the tools in our toolkit to be able to have these conversations. So I am going to turn it over to Nick and to Sabrina to tell you what this project has looked like in Appleton.
Thank you, Donna, and I will take this time to share my screen.
Appreciating all the great conversations so far. Keep it going. Ask questions. We'll get to them at the end.
And, oh, okay, this is what I want. Welcome, everyone. We're really appreciative that you're coming today. We really want our session to be interactive and for you to actively use the chat or submit your questions. Nick and I and Donna, we do have a script, but I really don't want to follow it. I want a chance to just really feel like we're chatting in our homes and just having this conversation and sharing what we know. So we had Donna started off with a nice intro, and then in this section, I will serve as one of the chattees and also helping to lead. And then you may see us ask each other questions. And so that's your opportunity to ask questions as well. So Donna will have 2 hats. She'll chat with us, but she is also our chat moderator. So I am Dr. Sabrina Robbins. I am a board member of African Heritage. I live in Appleton, Wisconsin. Unlike many of you, I am not a full-time or part-time historian. I work for a global staffing company, and I specialize in workforce solutions and labor rates and trends. But I have a deep, deep passion for African American history and serving as my role in my community as a custodian of our history. So having the opportunity to speak with you all really is a deep pleasure of mine, and I'm very excited to be here to share this. We don't have a lot of time together, so we won't necessarily go over the exhibit, but we will share our methodology and some of our findings and how our engagement in the Stone of Hope project will inform our path and how we engage in the Unvarnished project. So, and I do want to say that I've been living in the Fox Valley, Appleton area for 22 years. And here are my notes. So we started this project in 2014. At the time, Nick was with the History Museum at the castle. And together we created a civic engagement initiative to highlight marginalized history of Black experience in racial discrimination in Appleton. So this is the first major study of Blacks in northern Wisconsin, and the programming was shed light on a growing Black community before 1900. So, and we will also talk about a sundown custom that existed from 1920 to 1960 and how the civil rights movement impacted the city. I just want to take a time to acknowledge the collaborators. We also have the committee. I want to do a shout out to Antoinette Powell, who is in attendance today. So she is part of this work. And so I always like to acknowledge our collaborators and their institutions when we speak. So thank you, Antoinette. And then use the chat if you have questions or comments as well, please. So for this project, the Stone of Hope Experiences, there are 4 goals for this project. So it was first, create an affinity group to guide the project. 2, create research files for public use, including paper, oral histories, photographs, and artifacts. The 3rd goal is to create a small pop-up museum to visit schools, businesses, and public spaces. And lastly, create programs that further engages the community. So it's at this point, you'll see me transition from referencing Stone of Hope as an exhibit to an actual pop-up museum. So we see ourselves as curators as we guide and continue with the development of the Stone of Hope pop-up museum. When we started this project, the community told us there were no Blacks here before the late 1960s. And it simply just didn't make sense. And through curiosity and Nick Hoffman found an early picture of a Civil War vet, found evidence that, oh, there were Black people here. I wonder what else can I find out? And so that to me said, ain't gonna let no one turn me around, that we're going to dig in and find this history that has been, what we found, purposely erased, overlooked, ignored, and marginalized. And in honor of that work, we selected a quote from Carter G. Woodson, who is known as the father of Black history. So those who have no record of what their forefathers have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biography and history. We do exist, we have been here, and now with this project, we're going to document our history. Here's our team. Antoinette, you're in there. So we worked hard for a year. So it started in 2014. In 2015, it opened at the Juneteenth celebration that African Heritage hosts each year. That Juneteenth celebration is ranked number 7 in the US by NPR. And for those of you that are not aware, Juneteenth is the celebration and commemoration of the end of US chattel slavery in the United States. And so our project, we're at AAF Leadership in History Award. And the significance of winning together is we have our museum with us, represented by Nick. We have the community group, that's me in the purple dress, and Lawrence University with Antoinette there, along with the awardees. And so next we'll have Nick, and he will talk about the process and the collaboration and what our research methodology contained. Nick?
Yeah, sounds great. The project itself grew out of the community, and from the start had the goals of shared authority. And a lot of the conversation or secondhand stories about Appleton being a sundown town really started to percolate in the 1990s. There were occasionally letters to the editor, some investigative writing by reporters in the Appleton Post-Crescent. So there definitely was some intrigue that was starting to grow. So from the museum's perspective, we were really interested in looking at this history of a sundown town. How could we document in historical written records and oral history? But right when we started this, I reached out to a good friend of both Sabrina and I, Kathy Flores. And Kathy Flores immediately put the brakes on the project. And she said, before you get anywhere in this work, you need to do a representational analysis. Who needs to be in the room to do this right? And so we created a committee, and that committee included African Heritage Incorporated. They were there right from the beginning. Local historians who have dabbled in different pieces of this work, such as Aaron Dix at Lawrence University and Antoinette Powell, also at Lawrence University. So we also then intentionally removed all the barriers that tend to be there and don't need to be there in doing work through history organizations. We brought this forward in total shared authority. And one of our biggest pieces of that was that from the beginning, African Heritage was going to be involved in the creative process, in the writing process. They ultimately had first view of the project and our drafts, and also right before we went to print, last view of that work. They were completely in control of the language that we're using, terminology that we were using. So myself, as a historian, I really just became the guide on the side. I could help guide the research, but really it was the lived experiences and the scholarly expertise of Dr. Robbins and Dr. Bola Delano Oriarn, who really were going to guide so much of this work. And I know that there are a lot of small museums from all over Wisconsin and Illinois who are currently in this session. And I want to make sure we're giving you the right tools to do this work. I'm going to share in the chat a link from historian James Lowen. A website for Wisconsin. And what he's done is he took the census statistics for communities throughout the entire United States, but focusing primarily on the Midwest, and wanted to point out in each city's very clear trends in the census, where a community before 1900 would have a growing Black population, and then suddenly by 1920, that population dwindles down to 0 or to 1. And it wasn't his job to say whether or not those were sundown towns, but he did point out that there is a major trend that emerges in these communities, and it's all over the state. And so with our work, we knew from that there certainly was a sundown town at play. That's Appleton census to a T. We knew there was a larger Black community, and that's something else that I would warn. The census is not always doing a great job tracking African American, especially migrant work that's coming and going from the city. So often we would find in the cities that newspapers were describing the Black population much higher than the city census would be reporting. But as you're doing this work, there's some really, really clear pieces. For one, I would definitely look at the Black press. Make sure you're grounding your work through Black voices and Black agency. Too often when we're doing Black history in Wisconsin, we end up talking about the people who are on the periphery, the white abolitionists, the white people who had good intentions to help. But this work has got to be firmly grounded in the voices of African Americans. And so dig deep into newspapers like the Wisconsin Weekly Advocate. It's a gold mine for doing this work around 1900. The Chicago Defender is a great, reliable source talking about what was happening in Wisconsin. And then at the Wisconsin Historical Society, which just has this enormous collection, you will find those hidden gems that really describe what was going on. And we found that in the Wisconsin Department of Labor, records and also the Wisconsin Equal Rights Division records. Next slide. So as Sabrina and her team found, African Americans were here all the time. And while our work initially focused on whether or not we could, sorry, even though
sorry, we're missing a slide. So if you could just go ahead and talk about the Black history research and mostly white.
Yep, forward on. Next slide. So by the 1880s, African Americans had established businesses, attended integrated public schools. They were members of some integrated churches and even ran for local offices, with some winning. They were members of the Grand Army of the Republic, although in an organization that was not fully integrated into leadership or full participation. They settled, they owned homes. There was a tight regional community of Black families across the entire Fox cities, with veterans and business people who refer to themselves as the local Black aristocracy. They were established community leaders. In a city like Appleton, the population could have been anywhere from around 25 to maybe up to 100, depending on what time of year they were tracking the number of people who were working and living in the city. And we could go even farther back. We documented Black presence through the fur trade. We also knew that there were people who were enslaved in the 18th century and early 19th century in this part of Wisconsin. So there is this huge, rich history before 1900. Next slide. But while there was an opportunity of promise and hope in the Fox cities, there was definitely a far darker movement that was happening even as families were starting to settle in the region. During this time period, national reconstruction completely falls apart. There is wild and very wicked violence growing in the South. It's also growing in the Midwest. There are massacres of African Americans in Springfield, Illinois, Chicago, East St. Louis. So there's a massive wave of violence coming across the United States. And while Jim Crow is firmly established in the South, it also appears in the North and looks a little bit differently. We also had access to police records. Every prominent Black family that we found living in this time period was harassed from about the 1870s to the 1890s, including one individual named Horace Artis. You saw his picture on the first slide. Horace Artis was arrested for vagrancy in the city, even though he lived there. So the vagrancy law was really starting to be used to attack African Americans living in the city and other people that were defined as undesirable, like Italian laborers, members of labor unions. That law was really used to this advantage. The newspaper description, Appleton, no city for colored folks, that was the best description we found of how this worked. The police would have a patrol wagon parked at the train station just on the edge of town. In the instance for this article, Smith, who was a bricklayer, was arrested and immediately taken through town. While he went through town, it's noted that young children came out and yelled racial slurs at him while he was paraded through the city, and then he was told to get out of town the next day. That's our best glimpse into what that looked like. But the police department really owned this viewpoint. In fact, after the exhibit was completed, a new source came forward where we learned the police and fire department shared a mascot of a black cat for which they would take into parades, and they named the cat as an extremely vulgar racial slur. So this was deeply embedded into the culture of the police department. Next slide. And it also showed up in a lot of ways as this culture of Jim Crow really settled in Appleton. Area businesses and hotels conspired to deny Black business people. This is the first instance that we found of that. The Tuskegee Singers in 1915 could not find a place to stay in Appleton. An incredible study done in 1952 by a Lawrence student named Rosalie Keller. She cold called area businesses, and that provides the best view, but really also shows that because it wasn't an actual law in the city, this was a custom that people participated in, whether they knew about it or not. They were actively engaged. And so when she called places like Jake Skal's Colonial Wonder Bar, a very famous supper clubs are famously white in Wisconsin, and there's a reason for that. At Jake Skal's Colonial Wonder Bar, any Black business person who came to the area had to go to the back door and knock on the kitchen door to be served, and they'd have to eat outside. And so those types of practices were very common in Appleton and throughout the Fox Cities region. Furthermore, we found other Jim Crow policies. Racial covenants and housing deeds were common. Threats of violence with baseball teams were also common. And then finally, in the Wisconsin Equal Rights Division records at the Wisconsin Historical Society, there was a person who interviewed local industry owners, and it came just clear as day, perfectly written what was happening. A machinist from Appleton described what was going on as an unwritten law that prevents, in their words, Negroes from spending the night. And there it was, clear for us, Appleton firmly documented as a sundown town. Next slide. So the article with the headline, Appleton Loses Only Negro, is 100% absent or 100% accurate. It wasn't officially the last person, but the meaning is still there. By 1915 into 1920, Appleton's black population drops to zero. It became a city that was 100% white, like so many other cities throughout Wisconsin. And when doing this work, especially when we do presentations, a lot of people wanted to put all of this on the Ku Klux Klan. They wanted to identify that this happened because of a hate organization, not because of the broader city itself. But the thing is, the Ku Klux Klan doesn't have their second Klan rebirth in the Fox Cities until the mid-1920s. So all of this is happening well before they were active. Once the Klan is active, certainly they're promoting Appleton as an all-white city. They want to keep it all white. There were cross burnings. They promoted themselves through area Protestant churches, but they're not fully a part of this. So that's the big challenge for this work, is that it's not a hate group that was doing this. It was everyday citizens. My family's from Oshkosh, Wisconsin. My grandfather was a member of an all-white labor union. So my family is just as much a part of this process, this whiteness that was trying to be enforced in the Fox Cities during this time period. And it's important as historians, as we're doing this work, that we own that part of our history and grapple with that ourselves. So going forward throughout the 1950s into the 1960s, Appleton's a sundown town. Lawrence students today would still describe downtown Appleton especially as being a sundown town, a place that is often where they're harassed by whites, particularly driving by in vehicles. So there's a lot of work to be done. But again, going back to agency, it is Black Lawrence students in the 1960s that lead protests in the city and really challenge the university and the city to make a big difference. National leaders, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Representative John Lewis, Percy Julian, Dr. Angela Davis, some of the most monumental figures of the civil rights era came to Appleton and the Fox Cities and spoke to try and challenge the city to do a lot better. So it's on their work, their agency, as well as Allied whites, and how Appleton finally made that big change. Next slide. Oh, you're on mute, Sabrina.
It's always somebody talking with the mute on. Is this something happened with the order? Is this the next one you were expecting?
You're good.
Okay. Is this my slide?
You bet.
Okay, great. So Nick, thank you for sharing some of the things we found and the methodology. I don't know if anyone asked questions, but we were very, one of the things I just want to highlight, very intentional to include African Americans at the beginning of the project. The second thing is not co-opting the narrative or story and saving space so that we may speak and oftentimes speak first, so that we have first voice present and first voice active participation in there. And then lastly, winning together, sharing in the awards and recognitions. So we learned A lot. One, I started off my section saying we were told there was no Black history, and Blacks didn't show up in Appleton until the 1960s. As you see, there are plenty of primary resources and documentations to show that we were here, that we were active, and we've had a full life of business success and then hardship through sustained racial discrimination and violence against my people. And to the point that by the 1920 census, the Black population had dwindled down to 0. So what did we learn? We learned that our first thing is to make sure that we are not re-marginalized, that our existence is not erased from not only documentation, but from the community memory. No one in the community had stories or memories of Blacks existing before 1960s. We also learned the value of what collaboration looks like. So this is a picture of organizations. So you have Ron Dunlap, a member of African Heritage. We have our museum, Nick Hoffman, Dr. Bola Delano Oriaron. She's co-founder of African Heritage. And then in the with the glasses there in black and white, Kathy Flores. At the time, she worked for the city of Appleton. Now she works for Diverse and Resilient. And then you have myself, long-term community member and African Heritage member. And then we have Antoinette Powell, not with Lawrence University, and did a lot of work in sharing the files. Not pictured is Erin Dix. So she is absolutely part of the research. And so we learned that even though African Americans were driven out, that there was a presence of what we call the everyday activists. Those are white folks in the area standing in the gap, trying to help African Americans that came in the city. We had Marian Anderson, we had Ella Fitzgerald come in, and community members had to step up to allow, to influence hotel owners and restaurants to let these individuals stay in their hotels. And so we had Dr. Percy Julian, a world-renowned scientist, was offered a position with the Paper Institute here in Appleton, and he was not able to secure housing here. And so after that, he went and had a prolific career in Chicago. So as a person that is in workforce solutions and deal with employment, it's just really shows the negative impact that racism has on an entire region, and that you lack really taking advantage of the talent that's in the area. We also learned that every single institution and pathway was involved in Black life and restricting access on every single level. So it was a strong and entrenched systemic racism and racist structures in place to bar positive outcomes and lives of Black folks. We also learned the importance of having the support of your museum. And it was through this project that I really started to understand and value the role of the public historian. And I just want to say, as a community member, how much we need you. We need you to share your records. We need you to not whitewash the authentic experiences of African Americans. We ask that you attend events so that you will have the foresight and sense to help document what is going on. We're looking for you to, when we walk in your museums or hear about it, that we do see us if we know that we've been in that area. And so, and to make African American history live beyond February, that we are a part of life and we should show up as an inclusive story that you portray in your museums. If you have memorabilia or artifacts that shows racist or something like that, that you have the proper labeling to that. So it doesn't show that your institution feels that way, but it just simply reflects the sentiment of the time. And it gave us, being involved in this project, gave us a chance to look at people. It gave us a chance to look at practices, laws, and the impact that it has overall on the region, and then what does that mean for the future. So as a Truth and Reconciliation project, Appleton started really getting serious to digging in to say that's who we were, but that's not who we want to be in the future. Yes, we still have problems, and we have less people saying, oh, I didn't know that happened. This area is not large, but life experiences was just so far removed that many folks were just not aware of how African Americans were treated and are being treated in Appleton. And so we're still working on it. We're still trying to improve. But what I am proud to say is that it is becoming a part of our everyday conversation and awareness. Nick, you have anything to share?
It actually answers some of the questions that are popping up, is that this story is repeated everywhere in Wisconsin. And I challenge communities to start digging into this work. There are a lot of great projects underway. Stephen Kircher at UW Oshkosh, Victoria Tajan at De Pere. There's work happening in the Mineral District in Southwest Wisconsin, Pleasant Ridge, Cheyenne Valley, hopefully more work in Fox Lake. The point is, it's happening all over the place, but there's even so much more work to do. When we started doing our research, we started with just a few names, and believe me, there's a massive version of the story that we're not going to put on you today, but it just doesn't end. Once you know how to do this work, how to find the research, everything just keeps pouring forward. You'll eventually meet descendants, and they'll have more stories to tell. So this is really some of the most rewarding work and most impactful work that museums can do, and especially after the summer in Wisconsin with the unrest. All of that is happening because of these long histories in the state, and it's time for us to reconcile that history.
Yeah, I saw someone in the chat talk about a fourth grade teacher, Miss Potter. So, and I think it was Freedom. And so, you know, I say as your roles, amplify those voices. Don't make it a footnote or something. If Miss Potter was there teaching, then I say put her in contact. And then do some research. Does she have living descendants? Why was she there? The likelihood of her being the only African American there, especially being a woman, it may be slim. We also found that Blacks were in and out of the area, coming from Milwaukee as domestics and living there. So we have strong ties with Milwaukee in terms of the Black community and migration within the state.
Yeah, I would also like to add that if you have in your history what you found is singular instances of an African American family or a family of color, don't automatically make the assumption that that means that your community did not have racially restricted covenants or did not practice the practice of sundown. I can use Illinois as an example. And Jim Lowen really did do the seminal work on this, was the first one out with the Sundown Town books. And as Nick said, there's a lot of work being done now, but to use his research, he was raised in Central Illinois. He's a sociologist, and he wanted to take a look at this in Illinois. And he thought he would find, I don't know, a number of communities that practice sundown. By the time he was done, he was up to 70% of the communities, towns and cities in the state of Illinois that were all white, and most of them were all white on purpose. So when we're talking about this being a system, there are entire case laws on, and you can track that history of whether racially restricted covenants or religiously restricted covenants were viewed as legal or not within the context of federal law. So there's a lot out there. So I would encourage you not to make any assumptions and to dig a little bit deeper. It's really important to do that.
And it's great information. Sometimes white cities are that way on purpose. I moved here from Detroit many years ago, and Grosse Pointe, very wealthy area, didn't have street lights because the assumption was you should know where you're going. And you don't need, so you're invited to come in. So that's another example, another way of keeping people out.
So I think that there's a great question from Elizabeth from Long Island, New York, and glad you're here with us today, Elizabeth. It looks like you're really embarking on a project where you have a home of a wealthy, privileged white family, and you really want to begin telling the stories of people who live there over time. And some of the folks that you mentioned are laborers that have been there over the building's 300 years of occupancy, including Black laborers, indigenous people, immigrants. Your question is really around the fact that these stories haven't been addressed previously, and that you're really challenged by having a collection that reflects the views and the experiences of the family that has lived, the white family that's lived in the home. So I hope that when Nick and Sabrina were telling you their story of digging deeper, that you will be able to find these histories, and they're there. You just have to make the decision as an institution that you want to put in the time and the energy and the labor to do that. And I would really encourage you to reach out to the communities that you're looking to add into your storyline, because that is where you're also going to find your histories. But I wouldn't let lack of that collection right now stop you. And this is really a pivotal moment in time, I think, where the appreciation of telling whole histories is becoming more and more front and center. So I would use that momentum to be able to garner the resources that you need to be able to do that work.
I can already see you have so much to work with.
You do.
Besides New York City, all the communities that you identify, labor unions, immigrants, indigenous, Black, every one of those communities has one or multiple newspapers that you can pull from. And in those presses, they're going to be telling it like it is. So I would start there too. That's just a gold mine.
And I just want to say, Elizabeth, I'm really excited for you because of you had mentioned you had freed slaves, indentured service. You just have such a wealth of knowledge. Please keep us informed of what you are doing. It just sounds amazing. And we did not have such a rich, long history as you, certainly New York, and then we're looking at Northeast Wisconsin, so I'm just sort of jealous. So please pursue that work and share it with all of us.
If I have time for 1 second, I know we're wrapping up soon. I want to answer Stephen Kircher's question. He's interested in the story of African-American land loss in Wisconsin during the late 19th and early 20th century. And what do we know about how many of the African-Americans who live in the rural area were farming the land and or holders? And that's a huge project that needs to happen. We need to re-examine Pleasant Ridge. I know there's people at UW-Platteville who are looking at that. There hasn't been a lot of work on the Fox Lake community, Cheyenne Valley outside Hillsborough, and then of course, right where you live, Stephen, in Neenah, there's rural Black communities. And I think that land loss is pretty apparent, and I think could be documented through atlases. And there's even more complications with it. In Hillsborough, Wisconsin, which was where I was born, I've noticed that the community was extremely separated, Black and white. The city itself in the census only records in one of the decades one African-American. The African-American community is very intentionally right on the edge of town. There also happened to be a 6 o'clock whistle every night. So there's little clues, nothing confirmed, but definitely clues that suggest there needs to be a lot more digging into what was happening in Hillsborough and Cheyenne Valley. And there's a really wonderful heritage group that's doing some of that.
I wanted to know if we could take time to answer Rick's question. Rick had a question saying what other Wisconsin communities are right for this kind of study, and he mentioned Native Americans, and there absolutely are. Using this methodology plus the tribal records and going on the reservations can really inform your work. There are some outstanding historians in this area. Donna, is Cinnamon, does she just do that kind of work?
Yeah,
so absolutely use this methodology. There are certainly other marginalized communities of people of color, but also others, mental illness, and we have the homeless and LGBT, and some form of the methodology that was presented here today can certainly be applied to your situation. And then Rick had a question specifically for Nick. How do you plan to pursue this kind of study in your new position at WHS, Wisconsin Historical Society?
Well, it's definitely a shift in how we do work. We, for one, have to build out a better understanding of African-American history in Wisconsin. Because if you just take one little example like Appleton, once we did that work, it was impossible for almost all the projects that we did. There was always going to be Black voices, Black experiences in that work. It didn't matter if we were talking about labor and breweries, haunted histories with a woman, African-American woman who could talk to the dead. That was pretty interesting to learn about that person. So my point is we could just mesh. It was just a natural part of what we did. So that's where we need to get at the Wisconsin Historical Society. And we have the whole state, all of these incredible stories. George Edwin Taylor, the first African-American to run for president in the early 1900s. From La Crosse, and one that is largely marginalized here in Madison, a Wisconsin coach, George Pogue, track coach, also a great history student, I should note, was the first American medalist in the Olympics. He won 2 medals at the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis. There are so many stories to both celebrate and raise up, but then also really get down to the core, because when we start working on this history, we look at why communities are all white and how that occurred. That's where we really have a lot of lessons today that we need to grapple with, because Wisconsin is becoming a much more diverse state, thankfully, finally. But to understand this history and have those tools, it's going to set us up on a much better course for the future.
I have another question I wanted to, Donna, go ahead, and then I want to make sure we get Stephen Rice.
Just 2 quick things. One is Amy Lonetree wrote a great book on decolonizing museums. For those of you who want to begin to include Indigenous histories, I would encourage you to buy that book and read it, and start doing the legwork on that. Secondly, Stephen Rice asked a great question about, have you faced community resistance to telling these stories? Do you have advice for organizations in small communities with entrenched historical narratives where attempts to bring in marginalized perspectives might be met with hostility? And the answer to that question is yes. There are, and that is why we did the research that we did, to find out how open Americans are to inclusive history. And not only to find out, to get a moment in time of looking at that, but also so that we could start looking at what does it mean to go down the road of inclusive history, and what are the things that you need to think about. And certainly you need to think about working with your staff, with your volunteers, with your board, to make sure that everybody is in the same place and understanding that you need to tell a whole history. Because these are whole histories. I think Sabrina's point about not marginalizing Black history to February, Black history is American history. And that's where we need to go, so that the voices are at the table, so that the voices and the narratives are embedded in the work that we do. But I'm not going to tell you you're never going to be challenged on it, because you probably will be. But you need to be ready for that.
And we were challenged. We were challenged, and it shows up in different ways. As involved and entrenched as African heritage is, we as an organization still have to fight being marginalized and erased from our own work. I'm in the community, and they will reference our work and not even know or mention African heritage name. So I saw another question is saying, oh, this is part of larger communities like Wisconsin, like Milwaukee and Madison. No, when you look at Lowen's maps, and we have an understanding, I just want to restate, I've been living in northern Wisconsin 22 years. This does exist in these small areas that we, even today, do not feel welcomed in your communities. And we do get the message from businesses, from police, from community members that we are not welcomed here. And so this type of sundown mentality and history is entrenched throughout Northeast Wisconsin. And I will just posit and say, New York. Maybe was a pocket somewhere, but it certainly from a community standpoint represents a mindset and practice, and it's even codified in our state constitution, the status of African Americans in there, that we did not have personhood here.
There is a big shift of the population moving into larger cities where there's larger Black populations and more safety. But then what you'll also notice, in Indianapolis is a great example. Once that happens in Indiana, it's basically a fortified ring of all white suburbs all the way around the city. So it's an attempt to always just have that control over movement of African Americans. And in Indianapolis is a great example of that.
So there's another question in the queue about a research guide. And this particular project, we are going to be writing technical bulletins and that sort of thing in the coming year with what we've learned, what we've encountered in each of our 6 communities in which our project is based. So I think you're going to see more and more of this kind of, these kinds of resources out there.
Yeah, and deal with Robert Newberry.
Sure.
So Robert says that in Green Bay, that, wow, despite the Green Bay Packers presence, he thought that an African American would not feel safe. Green Bay has the same challenge as others, and there is a safety issue that many African Americans feel. Now you're referencing the 70s. That's still present today. It's present in Appleton. It's present wherever we go. And so I would say that it is in the tradition of Black experience in Northeast Wisconsin. And as we see with the Black Lives Matter movement that's going on even here in these white areas, that police, safety from police is still an issue. What I do want to note is that I am seeing a shift because especially here in Northeast Wisconsin, in vastly predominantly white communities, we're seeing a lot of white participation, and they outnumber Black participation in these various Black Lives Matter movement. And so there is hope for a better day. And that's why we call it Stone of Hope. And that I do want to share, as an African American, all of our life is not challenged. There are some beautiful, wonderful, joyous parts of who we are. We're very proud of that. Our culture, we're very proud. And then we're just here acknowledging. So I don't want it to appear that we're just downtrodden and not without joy in our lives. We could have some more joy if these things didn't happen, and if we all didn't have the disproportionate impact of COVID on our lives. But having an informed and inclusive understanding of the American experience, that it's not just white, it's not just Black and white, it is all of these other things. And so we're hoping today that you look at our methodologies, that you look at the practices within your institutions, that you invite your community members, representative community members, to feel welcome and collaborate with you. Treat them as equals and make sure that they are acknowledged both in print and in presence within your institutions and your work. And that you look at Black history more than February, that you make it the part of your DNA of your institution.